Shadows in the courtroom. The grand courtroom of Belmont County Courthouse stood bathed in muted morning light, beams filtering through the high windows, splitting across the polished oak floors like fractured glass. The stale scent of old wood, ink, and sweat hovered in the air. The smell of history, of countless verdicts passed and lives forever altered within these walls. Judge Ellis Mathers sat on the high bench, his robe draped over him like the heavy mantle of authority it had become after nearly 30 years on the bench. His gavel, worn smooth from years of sentencing, sat within arm's reach, ready to punctuate another chapter of justice with a final, definitive crack. He had built his career on being firm, fair, and feared. Known for his meticulous, even merciless rulings, Judge Mathers was the kind of man who made attorneys nervous just by stepping into the courtroom. His stern, unflinching gaze swept over the room, settling briefly on the defendant. A girl, no more than 18, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as though she were in church. Her name was Kyra Lattimore. Petite, wiry, with skin the shade of burnt caramel and dark-haired, tied into 2 hurried braids. Her clothes, an oversized hoodie, frayed jeans, told stories of thrift store racks and foster home hand-me-downs. Despite her small frame, her presence crackled like a wire stretched just to the point of snapping. There was something in her eyes, a quiet defiance, the sort of resolve that rarely made it to this courtroom. The charge was minor, petty theft. A cheap bracelet from a local department store, open and shut, hardly worth the ink on the docket. But something about the way Kyra sat, the slight tremor in her hands, made Judge Mathers pause, just for a heartbeat. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Marjorie Linscott stood tall, her sharp suit gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her voice was clipped, professional, stripped of sympathy as she recited the facts. Surveillance footage, store security logs, the all-too-familiar downward spiral of foster kids stealing things they didn't need because life had already stolen so much from them. Kyra's court-appointed attorney, Philip Grant, fumbled with his notes, sweat beading at his temples. Public defenders in Belmont were always stretched thin, files stacked so high on their desks they couldn't even remember the faces attached to the names. He stammered something about difficult childhood and no prior offenses. The words hung in the air like empty offerings. Judge Mathers shifted in his chair, preparing to issue his ruling. His gavel felt heavier than usual in his hand, but he lifted it just the same. And then Kyra spoke. "Daddy." The single word cut through the air like a blade. The gavel stopped midair. A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the gallery, and even ADA Linscott's practiced poise cracked just slightly. Philip Grant turned to his client, his eyes wide with confusion. Judge Mathers paled, visibly, sickly. His knuckles whitened around the gavel, veins standing out against the weathered skin. His carefully controlled expression shattered for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, every mask he had worn for 30 years slipped. For a heartbeat, the room saw him, not the judge, but the man. Kyra stood, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice unwavering. "You left me. You left my mom." Mathers' throat worked, a dry swallow barely audible over the stunned silence. Cameras clicked. Journalists who had come for a routine case, now scrambling for their phones, their notes. "You're my father." Kyra's voice rang out, stronger this time. "You walked away, and you thought I wouldn't find you." The whispers became a roar. Reporters surged forward, bailiffs moving to contain the chaos. Someone's pen clattered to the floor, the tiny sound echoing through the cavernous room. Judge Mathers' mind reeled. He had always known the past might catch up to him one day, but not like this. Not here. Not now. 24 years earlier. A cheap motel on the south side of Belmont, its neon sign flickering weakly against the rain-slick pavement. Inside room 206, Camille Lattimore sat cross-legged on the bed, a yellowed law textbook in her lap. A tattered notebook lay beside her, margins scrawled with notes. Dreams of passing the bar, of becoming someone her daughter could be proud of. Ellis stood at the window, his silhouette cut against the dim streetlights outside. His tie hung loose, sleeves rolled up, the weight of his double life settling heavy on his shoulders. "You told me you were getting divorced," Camille said quietly, her fingers tracing the frayed edge of the blanket. "You said this wasn't just an affair." Ellis turned, his face shadowed in the half-light. "I meant it." "Then why are you still wearing your ring?" The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Camille knew the answer, even if she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. A black woman with big dreams and a belly growing rounder each day was never going to fit into the world of white country clubs and political fundraisers. "We could leave," she said softly. "Start fresh somewhere else. You wouldn't have to hide us." Ellis crossed the room, kneeling beside her. His hand, so large, so capable, rested against her stomach, feeling the faint flutter of life beneath her skin. His daughter, his blood. But in the end, blood wasn't enough. Present day. Mathers stumbled into his chambers, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him. His hand trembled as he poured bourbon into a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim and staining the paperwork on his desk. He sank into his leather chair, staring at the worn photograph half buried beneath legal briefs and correspondence. Camille, her smile bright even as her eyes held secrets. Her hands rested protectively over her swollen belly. Kyra, just a flutter beneath her skin. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. His wife's name, Evelyn, glowed on the screen. With shaking hands, he silenced the call. The knock on his door came next. 3 sharp raps, followed by the creak of hinges. Kyra stood there, framed by the dim hallway light, her eyes so much like her mother's that it felt like a knife to his chest. "You lied to everyone," she said quietly. "But you lied to yourself the most." He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. "I don't want money," Kyra said, stepping into the room. "I don't want an apology." "Then what do you want?" His voice was hoarse, ragged. "I want the truth." The weight of decades settled around them. The truth had teeth, sharp enough to rip apart everything Ellis Mathers had built. His career, his family, his legacy. But standing there, in the shadow of the daughter he had abandoned, he knew there was no escaping it. The truth was here, and it had found its voice. The weight of names and the price of silence. The hallway outside Judge Ellis Mathers' chambers felt suffocating, despite the cool courthouse air conditioning. Kyra stood there, her back pressed against the wood-paneled wall, arms folded tightly across her chest, as though holding herself together by sheer will. Reporters still swarmed the main hall downstairs, hungry for scraps of scandal, but up here, silence hung heavy. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but her face stayed calm. It wasn't the kind of calm that came from peace. It was the stillness of standing at the edge of a cliff, peering down into darkness. She hadn't expected him to look so human, smaller than he seemed from afar. His black robes and harsh rulings had made him seem like a force of nature, an immovable pillar of judgment. But when she'd called him daddy, all that power collapsed into a trembling, hollow man. She wanted to feel triumph, but all she felt was exhaustion. The door to his chambers hadn't quite closed all the way. A sliver of light spilled out into the hallway, broken only by the faint shadow of his pacing form. His voice was low, hoarse, talking to someone on the phone. No, I didn't know she'd be here. You think I would have let this happen?" A pause. "Don't tell me what's at stake. I know exactly what's at stake." Another silence. His pacing stopped. She can't know everything. Kyra's stomach twisted. There was a bigger everything, something larger than abandonment. She already knew the outline of her story. A judge who left a black woman and her daughter to fend for themselves in a city that chewed up the vulnerable and spit them out. But there was more, something deep enough to make the unflappable Judge Ellis Mathers panic. The door swung open before she could step away. He froze when he saw her standing there, his phone still clutched in his hand. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, Kyra knew. He was afraid of her. "What do you want?" His voice was low, stripped of its usual authority. "The truth," she said softly, "and not the kind you hand out in court." He stepped aside, motioning her into the room. She crossed the threshold, her sneakers scuffing against the marble floor as she entered a space most defendants never saw. His office was exactly what she expected. Dark wood shelves lined with law books that probably hadn't been opened in years, certificates and plaques that declared him a paragon of justice, photographs with governors and senators. At the center of it all was a photo that didn't belong. A faded, slightly curled picture of a young woman with warm brown skin and tired eyes, standing in front of a peeling apartment door. Camille, her mother. Kyra reached for it before she realized her hand was shaking. "You kept this," she said quietly. He didn't answer. She turned to face him. "Why did you leave?" He leaned against the desk, his hands braced on the polished surface, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Because I was a coward," he said, "and because the Mather's name meant more to me than you did." Kyra's throat tightened, but she pushed forward. "Who were you talking to on the phone just now?" "No one you need to worry about. That's not your decision anymore." He gave a hollow laugh. "You think just because you showed up in my courtroom, you hold all the cards. You don't know what you've stepped into." Kyra stepped closer until only the desk separated them. "Then explain it to me." His gaze flickered toward the door, the shadows in the hallway. He lowered his voice. "This isn't about me and your mother anymore. There are people, powerful people, who've spent decades making sure the truth about certain things stays buried." "What things?" Her voice was sharp. He didn't answer, but the silence told her enough. Her mother's death wasn't an accident. Kyra had always suspected. It was the kind of tragedy that felt too convenient, too neatly folded into the system's indifference. But if Mathers was afraid to speak even here, in his own chambers, it meant someone else was pulling the strings. Kyra swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not until I get answers." He stared at her for a long moment, then walked to a small safe tucked behind the law books. With trembling fingers, he spun the combination and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were papers, letters, contracts, things written on official letterhead, stamped with seals Kyra didn't recognize. He slid the envelope across the desk. "Start here," he said, "and be careful who you trust." She reached for it, her fingers brushing the paper. For a moment, they were both still, his hand and hers, side by side. A lifetime apart, but connected by something neither of them could escape. "Why now?" she asked. "Why give this to me?" He swallowed hard. "Because I spent your whole life running from the truth. And now, the only thing I can do is help you survive it." Kyra tucked the envelope under her arm and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "You're not my father," she said softly, "but you'll help me find out who killed my mother." And then she was gone. Later that night, Kyra sat cross-legged on her thin mattress, the flickering light of a second-hand lamp illuminating the papers spread across her lap. Names, dates, payment records, photographs. Half of it was redacted, names blacked out so thoroughly the paper had worn thin. But the outlines were clear enough. The Mathers family, Ella's father, his uncles, his mentors, they hadn't just been judges and lawyers. They had been something more, something darker. Deals made in back rooms, favors traded not for justice, but for silence. Her mother had known. That was why they'd made her disappear. A knock at the door snapped Kyra out of her trance. She shoved the papers under the mattress and grabbed the metal baseball bat she kept by the door before peering through the peephole. Leah stood outside, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression tense. Kyra opened the door just wide enough to meet her eyes. Leah Richardson had been her caseworker back when Kyra was still bouncing from foster home to foster home, and they'd kept in touch. Not exactly friends, but something close. You're all over the news, Leah said, her voice hushed. What the hell did you do? Kyra stepped back to let her in. Leah's sharp heels clicked against the peeling linoleum, her expensive perfume clashing with the mildew scent of the apartment. Kyra handed her the envelope. This, Kyra said, this is what I did. Leah's brow furrowed as she flipped through the documents. Where did you get this? Judge Mathers gave it to me. Leah's head snapped up. The judge. Are you telling me? He's my biological father. Kyra's voice was flat. And my mother didn't just die in a car accident. Someone made sure she'd never talk. Leah's fingers tightened on the papers. Kyra, this is dangerous. If even half of this is true. It's all true. Kyra's voice cut through her doubt. And I'm going to prove it. Leah's hesitation flickered in her eyes. But then she nodded. Then we do it right. No shortcuts. No social media callouts. Paper trails, real evidence. And we keep this quiet. Kyra exhaled, some of the tension in her chest loosening. Quiet, she repeated. Got it. But as she said the word, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. Against her better judgment, she answered. You should have stayed quiet. The voice on the other end said, you won't get another warning. The line went dead. Leah stared at her. Who was that? Kyra's voice shook. Someone who thinks silence can still save them. The bones beneath the foundation. The dim bulb overhead flickered, casting jagged shadows along the cracked walls of Kyra's tiny apartment. The envelope of secrets sat open on the scared wooden table, its contents spread out like a jigsaw puzzle with no edges. Leah Richardson stood at the window, her fingers twitching with the urge to close the blinds fully, as though sheer cloth could stop the feeling of eyes watching from the street below. You need to get out of here, Leah said for the third time, her voice tight with urgency. They already know you have this. Kyra sat on the edge of her mattress, hands clasped between her knees, her jaw clenched. I'm not running. Then you're going to die, Leah snapped, her lawyer's composure cracking. Whoever's behind this, they don't send warnings just for fun. Kyra's fingers brushed the corner of a photo, her mother, Camille, smiling in the sun outside a building Kyra didn't recognize. It was tucked into the file with a handwritten date on the back. August 23, 2005. The day before her mother's car was found mangled at the bottom of a ravine. Kyra looked up at Leah, her eyes hard. I'm not my mother. They won't erase me. Leah exhaled, pacing the narrow space between the table and the peeling wall. You're not listening. This isn't just some judge who cheated on his wife. It's not even just about your mom. She pulled out one of the papers, the only one that hadn't been fully redacted, a property transfer signed by Walter Mathers, Ella's father, back in 1987. The property itself was worthless, an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Belmont's old industrial district. But the buyer's name was the key. James Whittaker. Leah dropped the paper on the table. This name came up in every corrupt land deal and racketeering case in this county for 30 years. Kyra frowned. Who is he? Leah hesitated, the weight of the answer visible in her tightened jaw. He's Ellis Mathers' brother-in-law. Eleanor Mathers' older brother. Kyra's stomach dropped. That's right, Leah said softly. The same man who made sure your mom's death was ruled an accident. Kyra leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her breath coming fast. What does a real estate transfer have to do with my mother? Leah flipped through the pages, stopping at a grainy photocopy of a contract attached to the property transfer. A security agreement for the storage and transport of archived materials. The wording was deliberately vague, but Lee had spent her entire career reading between the lines. This wasn't about land, Leah said. It was about documents, ledgers, records, proof of deals, probably dirty ones. The Mathers family and Whittaker were hiding something out there. Kyra's heart pounded. And my mom knew. Leah nodded grimly. She didn't just know Kyra. She had proof. Kyra swallowed hard, her mind racing. If her mother had proof, where was it now? She must have left something, Kyra said. Somewhere. Leah tapped her pen on the table. She was smart enough to make copies, I guarantee it. The question is, where would she hide something if she knew her life was in danger? Kyra stared at the photo of her mother, the light in Camille's eyes still bright despite the weight she'd carried. The answer was so simple, it almost made her laugh. With me, Kyra said softly. Leah frowned. What? If my mom knew she was in danger, Kyra said, her fingers brushing the photo. She wouldn't have hidden it somewhere random. She would have hidden it with me. Leah's eyes narrowed. But you were a baby. Kyra stood up, pacing. She used to tell me stories, when I was little before she died, about hiding treasures in places no one would think to look. Leah's brow furrowed. What kind of places? Kyra's heart raced as memories flickered. The old baby blanket, the stuffed rabbit with the stitched-up ear, the torn lining in the car seat she used to sit in. Things they'd never throw away, Kyra whispered. The storage unit. The next day, Leah drove them to a battered self-storage facility on the edge of Belmont, where the city's skyline faded into rusted fences and crumbling brick. The afternoon sun beat down, shimmering off the cracked asphalt like heat off a stovetop. Rows of storage units stretched in both directions, their doors dented and scarred from years of neglect. Unit 403 was hers. The key was old and slightly bent, the tag handwritten in her mother's looping script. Kyra's hand shook slightly as she slid it into the lock, the metal protesting before finally clicking open. The door groaned as it rolled up. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stale scent of cardboard and forgotten things. Boxes were stacked in uneven towers, some sagging with age, others taped shut with the kind of care only a mother would use. A folded baby stroller leaned against the far wall, next to a high chair draped in a yellowed blanket covered in faded ducks. Kyra swallowed the lump in her throat and stepped inside. Where would she hide something? Leah asked quietly. Kyra didn't answer. She was already moving, pulling back the baby blanket, her fingers tracing the seams of the high chair's cushion. There, a small tear, barely visible unless you knew to look. Her fingers slipped inside, pulling out a crumpled envelope sealed with tape so old it had gone brittle. Inside were photos, grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to make Kyra's stomach twist. Men in suits shaking hands. Envelopes exchanged. A younger Judge Ellis Mather standing next to James Whittaker, both smiling like they owned the world. Behind them, the warehouse from the property transfer. There's more, Leah said, pulling open a battered box labeled KYRA, baby. Inside, tucked beneath baby clothes and worn books, was a VHS tape. Kyra held it up, her heart pounding. Do you have anything that can play this? Leah asked. Kyra shook her head. My foster homes barely had working TVs. Leah's mouth tightened. We'll find a way. They didn't notice the car idling at the end of the row. A black sedan with tinted windows, watching. The tape. That night, they found a pawn shop downtown that still had a VHS player. The shopkeeper barely looked up as they paid in cash, the player dented and dusty but functional. Back at Leah's apartment, they plugged it into an old TV. The screen flickered before settling into grainy black and white footage. The camera was hidden, shaky, positioned behind a stack of crates. The warehouse was dimly lit, but the faces were clear enough. James Whittaker stood with two other men, one of them holding a thick manila folder. She's a liability, Whittaker's voice said. You should have handled this already. Mathers is getting sloppy, one of the other men said. He thinks no one's watching. I'll take care of her, Whittaker said. The tape crackled, the sound cutting in and out, but the words were unmistakable. Camille Lattimore. She knows too much. Kyra's breath caught in her throat. The screen cut to black. Proof, Leah whispered. We have them. Kyra stared at the screen, her hands trembling. They killed her, Kyra said, her voice hollow. They didn't just let her die. They planned it. Leah stood, pacing the length of the room. We have to go public with this. Kyra shook her head. Not yet. There's more. More. Someone called me, Kyra said. They said I should have stayed quiet. Leah's face paled. They're watching. Kyra's eyes were hard. Let them. But inside, her heart pounded with fear, not for herself, but for the mother who had died trying to protect her, and the truth that had been buried with her. Now that truth was rising, and nothing would stop it. The sins of the fathers. The hum of Leah's old air conditioning unit filled her apartment, a thin, rattling sound that barely masked the tension thickening the air. Kyra sat on the floor, her back pressed against the couch, the worn VHS tape still in her lap. The images on the screen had long faded to black, but her mother's name, spoken like a death sentence, echoed in her ears. Across from her, Leah stood at the window, 2 fingers parting the blinds just enough to peek outside. Every set of headlights crawling down the block made her fingers twitch closer to the small pistol holstered under her cardigan. You're sure you didn't see anyone following us? Leah asked, her voice tight. No. Kyra's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the tape. But they're watching. I know it. Leah let the blinds fall shut, turning to face her. This tape changes everything. It's not just proof they were watching your mom. It's proof they planned her death. Conspiracy. First-degree murder. She shook her head, almost in disbelief. James Whittaker and whoever worked with him. They didn't just cover up her death. They ordered it. Kyra's fingers dug into the tape's plastic edges. They destroyed her, and they left me with nothing. You still have this, Leah said softly. And that makes you dangerous. Kyra stood, pacing the length of the tiny living room. Her pulse hammered in her ears, a low drumbeat of fear and rage mixing into something sharper. Purpose. My mother trusted the wrong people, Kyra said. I won't. Which means, Leah said carefully, we don't just go to the police. Kyra's laugh was dry and humorless. The police worked for the Mathers family. My mother reported threats 2 weeks before she died. The complaint disappeared. There's no one to trust. Leah chewed her lip, considering. There might be someone. Who? A reporter. Kyra shook her head. They'll bury the story before it even gets printed. Not this one. Leah pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the name. Zaire Coleman. She's independent. Runs her own investigative site. Doesn't owe anyone favors. If we give her the right evidence, she'll run it. Kyra exhaled slowly. Let's do it. Leah hit call. The meeting. The cafe was nearly empty, the kind of hole-in-the-wall spot where the coffee was thick. The tables were worn, and the walls were lined with old posters for local protests and rallies long past. The place smelled faintly of burnt espresso and rain-soaked pavement. Zaire Coleman sat at a back booth, her long braids piled on top of her head in a messy knot, thick black glasses sliding down her nose as she scrolled through her laptop. Her oversized army jacket draped off her shoulders, paint stains still clinging to the cuffs. When Kyra and Leah slid into the booth across from her, Zaire's sharp eyes flicked up, scanning them with the cool efficiency of someone who had been lied to far too many times. You got 15 minutes, Zaire said, voice low but firm. If I think you're full of shit, I'm walking. Leah glanced at Kyra. Show her. Kyra pulled out the VHS tape, setting it on the table between them. Zaire raised a brow. What is this, 1997? Just watch it, Kyra said. Leah passed over a portable player they'd borrowed from the pawn shop. Zaire plugged it into her laptop, the grainy footage flickering to life on the screen. Kyra didn't watch. She didn't need to. Every frame was already burned into her mind. The tape ended. Zaire leaned back, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Where did you get this? she asked. My mom, Kyra said. She hid it before she was murdered. Zaire drummed her fingers on the table. You got anything else? This alone might not be enough. Leah handed over a manila envelope, copies of the property transfers, the redacted contracts, even Camille's letters, begging Judge Ellis Mathers for help. Zaire flipped through them, her face darkening with every page. Goddamn, she muttered. This is organized crime-level corruption. Judges, prosecutors, real estate scams, murder for hire, all tied up in a neat little generational bow. She looked up at Kyra. You realize this story's going to blow up your whole life. It's already blown up, Kyra said quietly. Zaire's expression softened. Okay, but if I'm running this, I need to verify it myself. And that means getting close. How close? Leah asked warily. Close enough to shake the tree, Zaire said. And see what falls out. Kyra's stomach twisted, but she nodded. Whatever it takes. The trapdoor in the past. That night, Kyra couldn't sleep. Leah had insisted she stay at her place. Her apartment was compromised, and there were too many cars she didn't recognize cruising her block. But even the relative safety of Leah's guest room couldn't ease the tightness in her chest. She stared at the ceiling, her mind drifting back, not to her mother's death, but to the memories she rarely let herself touch. The hidden things. When Kyra was 6, her mother had turned hiding into a game. She'd hide coins in the hems of curtains, tuck notes into the lining of old jackets. Always have a backup, her mother would whisper, her voice playful, but her eyes far away. Just in case. Kyra hadn't understood back then. But now, she sat up suddenly, heart racing. What is it? Leah asked, half asleep in the next room. I think I know where the rest of the proof is. Camille's old apartment. The building had been condemned for nearly a decade, but that didn't stop people from using it. Empty beer bottles and cigarette butts littered the stairwell, and the faint scent of mold clung to the peeling wallpaper. Kyra stood in front of apartment 3C, her mother's old place. The lock was rusted, but with enough force, Leah's crowbar popped the door open. The air inside was stale, the room a time capsule of poverty and survival. Faded curtains hung limply over cracked windows, and the linoleum floor curled at the edges. Kyra stepped inside, every breath thick with ghosts. She moved to the hall closet, her fingers tracing the seam of the floorboards. The wood was softer here, and with the edge of her pocket knife, she pried up a plank. Beneath it, wrapped in plastic, yellowed with age, was a second envelope. Hands trembling, Kyra opened it. Inside was a set of photographs, clearer this time, of men at the warehouse, carrying boxes marked with court seals and law firm logos. In the center of one photo stood Eleanor Mathers, her face hard with determination, her manicured hand resting on a crate labeled Camille Lattimore. Case 046732. Kyra's vision blurred with rage. Her mother's life had been boxed and buried like evidence, her existence reduced to a file number. There's more, Leah said, pulling out a folded letter. It was addressed to Ellis Mathers, but it was unsigned. If she doesn't back off, we'll handle her. Protect your family. This ends with her. Kyra's grip on the letter shook. Eleanor ordered it, Leah said softly. No, Kyra whispered. She didn't just order it. She held up the final photo, taken through the windshield of a car, the image blurry but unmistakable. Eleanor Mathers, standing over Camille's wrecked car, her face lit by the glow of headlights, watching as the life drained from Kyra's mother. She was there, Kyra said. She watched her die. Leah's face went pale. We need to leave. Now. Footsteps echoed in the stairwell. Kyra shoved the photos into her jacket, her heart pounding. Leah reached for her gun. The door creaked open. A man stepped inside, suit clean, eyes cold, hand resting on the butt of his gun. Kyra recognized him from the photos, one of James Whittaker's men. Miss Lattimore, he said, his smile razor-sharp. Your presence has been requested. Kyra took a step back. By who? By the people who don't like you digging in the dirt. The man raised the gun, and Leah fired first. The crack of the gunshot shattered the silence, and the man slumped to the floor. Kyra's ears rang, her pulse hammering in her chest. Go! Leah grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the fire escape. As they climbed into the night, Kyra knew the secrets were out, and now there was no turning back. Bloodlines and broken promises. The night air pressed thick against Kyra's skin as she and Leah sprinted down the rusted fire escape, each metal step groaning beneath their weight. Behind them, the sharp crack of Leah's gunshot still echoed in her ears, blending with the rush of blood pounding through her skull. Somewhere below, a dog barked, the sound startling in the silence. Kyra's fingers were tight around the envelope she pulled from beneath the floorboards, proof that Eleanor Mathers hadn't just orchestrated Camille's death, but had watched it happen. She didn't just order the hit. She made sure it was carried out. They hit the pavement hard, Kyra stumbling but Leah yanking her forward. A black sedan sat idling across the street, its headlights off, but its presence unmistakable. They're still watching, Kyra panted, her breath burning in her throat. They'll always be watching now, Leah said grimly. But we're done running. Kyra wasn't so sure. The judge's confession. They found Judge Ellis Mathers where they knew he'd be. In his private study, a lowball glass of bourbon half empty in front of him, his sleeves rolled up, and the weight of a lifetime in his eyes. His tie hung loose, and the light from his desk lamp cast long shadows across his face, making the lines at his mouth and eyes look deeper, carved from stone and gilt. Kyra slammed the envelope onto his desk, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet room. Explain this, she demanded. He didn't touch it, didn't need to. One glance at the corner of the photo peeking out was enough to drain the color from his face. How did you get this? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. My mom hid it, Kyra said. Like she knew one day I'd need to finish what she couldn't. Ellis Mathers closed his eyes, his fingers trembling as they traced the rim of his glass. She was always smarter than me, he said softly. Braver too. Kyra's fists clenched. Start talking. All of it. The judge sank into his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His mask, the calm, calculating face he wore in court, slipped away entirely. What was left was something Kyra had never expected to see. Shame. I met your mother at Whitaker and Hollis, he began. My father's firm. She was bright, quick, beautiful in a way that made people notice, even when they pretended not to. He exhaled, the memory cutting deeper than he was prepared for. I was engaged to Eleanor at the time, he said, not because I loved her, because our families needed that union. Two dynasties consolidating power, tightening their grip on the city. Marrying her was an obligation. Kyra's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. Her life, her very existence, was collateral damage in some centuries-old deal between wealthy white families who saw Belmont as their personal fiefdom. And my mom. Kyra's voice cracked. What was she? She was the first person who made me feel like more than my father's son. His voice dropped to almost a whisper, but I was too much of a coward to choose her. Kyra shook her head. That doesn't explain why Eleanor wanted her dead. Ellis' fingers dug into the edge of the desk. Because your mother found something she wasn't supposed to. Something Eleanor and James had been covering up for years. What? The judge's throat worked, but no sound came. Leah stepped forward, her voice sharp. We know about the property deals, the warehouses, the payoffs, your father's little side business, laundering dirty money through legal land transfers. That was just the surface. Ella's voice was a ghost of itself. There were bodies, too. Kyra's stomach dropped. What? People who crossed the wrong clients. Whistleblowers. Small-time activists who got too loud. The Mathers and Whitakers didn't just cover up crimes. They erased people. His voice faltered. Camille found the records, and she threatened to expose them. Kyra's nails dug into her palms until they ached, so they killed her. Ellis nodded, eyes red-rimmed. And I let them. The room went deathly silent. Leah's face was tight with fury, but it was Kyra who stepped closer, her voice shaking. You were my father. You could have saved her. I know. His voice broke, but I was weak. Kyra stared at him for a long moment, then took the envelope back. I'm not. The caller. They were barely back at Leah's apartment when Kyra's phone rang again. The number was blocked, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Eleanor Mathers. You're playing a very dangerous game, little girl. Eleanor's voice was smooth, cultured, the practiced veneer of someone who had never needed to raise it. And you're far too outmatched. Kyra's hand shook, but her voice stayed steady. You should have thought about that before you murdered my mother. A pause. Then, a soft, patronizing chuckle. You have no idea how deep this goes, do you? I know enough. Do you? Eleanor's voice sharpened. You think a handful of papers and a grainy tape will bring down the Mathers family. The judges, the city council, the police department, they all owe us favors. They'll bury you just like they buried your mother. Kyra's heart pounded, but the fire in her chest burned hotter than her fear. I'm not my mother. No, Eleanor said coldly. You're not. Because your mother had the sense to be afraid. The line went dead. Kyra set the phone down carefully, her hands trembling only once it was out of her grip. She's scared, Kyra said quietly. Leah frowned. That didn't sound like fear. It is, Kyra said. She wouldn't have called if she wasn't. The trap. 2 days later, a brown envelope appeared at Leah's door. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a message typed in bold block letters. If you want the rest, come alone. At the bottom was an address, an old estate on the edge of town, one Kyra recognized from her mother's photos. The Whittaker family's hunting lodge. This is a trap, Leah said immediately, pacing the small living room. Of course it's a trap, Kyra said, but it's the only way to end this. We can't just walk in there. Kyra shook her head. I'm not walking in. I'm crashing the damn door down. The estate. The hunting lodge was a hulking beast of a house, its dark wood siding half covered in ivy, its windows like empty eyes watching their approach. The gravel driveway crunched beneath their tires, and the trees lining the property swayed in the wind, whispering secrets no one would ever hear. Leah cut the engine. We call Zaire, she said. We have backup. No time. Kyra's hand was already on the door handle. They won't wait. They approached the house together, the silence pressing in from all sides. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking open on ancient hinges. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and damp earth. Kyra's footsteps were nearly silent on the thick rug, but her heart pounded so loudly it felt like it might echo off the walls. At the far end of the room, a figure sat in a high-backed chair. Eleanor Mathers. She looked as immaculate as ever. A cream suit, pearls at her throat. Not a hair out of place, but her eyes. Her eyes were sharp with something cold and ancient. Welcome home, Eleanor said, her smile thin as paper. Kyra didn't stop walking until she stood directly across from the woman who had ordered her mother's death. Where's the rest of the evidence? Eleanor steepled her fingers. There is no more evidence. Liar. A flicker of annoyance crossed Eleanor's face. It doesn't matter what you have. No one will believe you. Kyra held up her phone, the screen flashing red. I'm recording this. Eleanor's smile faded. You stupid girl. Kyra's voice was calm, but every muscle in her body shook with fury. Your time's up. From outside came the sudden blare of sirens. Eleanor's expression froze. Looks like someone called backup after all, Leah said from the doorway. Kyra smiled. The whole world's about to know. For the first time, Eleanor Mathers looked afraid. The cost of truth. The shriek of police sirens shattered the heavy silence that had settled over the Whittaker hunting lodge, their red and blue lights casting warped reflections through the old, wavy glass windows. Eleanor Mathers stood frozen in her immaculate cream suit, her knuckles white where her hands gripped the arms of her chair. Her composure, so carefully cultivated over decades, had begun to crack. Kyra stood in the center of the room, phone held high, the red recording light still flashing. Every second captured, every word preserved. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Kyra said, her voice low but vibrating with rage. Eleanor's lips curled into a tight smile, though her eyes flicked nervously toward the front door. "You think you've won. You think any of this matters." Leah stepped into the room behind Kyra, her pistol still in her hand, though now it hung loosely at her side. "It matters," Leah said, "and it's over." Eleanor's laughter was sharp and brittle, like breaking glass. "You really believe the system works for people like you? That evidence and recordings and truth mean a damn thing when the right people own the judges, the cops, the media. By tomorrow, all of this will be gone." Kyra's fingers tightened around her phone. Not this time. The front door banged open, and a cluster of officers stormed in, weapons drawn. Behind them stood Zara Coleman, her camera already rolling, capturing every moment from the safety of the porch. Eleanor flinched as the flash of the camera hit her face, exposing every line and crack beneath her perfect makeup. "Eleanor Mathers," the lead officer barked, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and racketeering." Eleanor's head lifted, her chin trembling just slightly. "On what evidence?" Kyra stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "My mother's voice. And yours." Leah held up the envelope they'd found, the photographs, the property transfers, the letters, each one another brick in the wall that would crush the Mathers and Whittaker legacy. Eleanor's breath hitched, her mask finally breaking apart. "You think you're so clever," she whispered, "but there's always someone above you, someone you'll never reach." Kyra's gaze didn't waver. "Let them come." The cuffs clicked around Eleanor's wrists, and the once mighty matriarch of Belmont County was led out into the night, her designer heels clicking on the warped wooden floor. Outside, the press swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like weapons. The perfect life Eleanor had spent decades curating was disintegrating under the bright, unforgiving lights. Kyra followed her out onto the porch, the cool air hitting her face like a slap. Leah stood at her side, Zer just behind them, camera still rolling. For the first time in her life, Kyra stood at the center of the story. Not the victim, not the forgotten daughter, but the one who brought the truth to light. The confession broadcast. The next morning, Kyra's face filled every screen in Belmont. Zaire's website had uploaded the full confession video. Eleanor Mathers' thin, cruel voice admitting to her part in Camille Lattimore's death, her certainty that her wealth and power would protect her. Coupled with the photos, the hidden documents, and the testimony of Judge Ellis Mathers himself, it was enough to detonate a bomb across the entire county's power structure. Anchors struggled to keep up with the unfolding scandal. Headlines screamed from every website and newspaper. Generations of corruption uncovered. Mathers and Whittaker dynasties crumble. Daughter of murdered whistleblower exposes criminal empire. Judge Mathers steps down, admits role in cover-up. Kyra sat in Leah's kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, her eyes locked on the screen. Each headline felt surreal, as though they belonged to someone else's story. Leah leaned against the counter, phone pressed to her ear, coordinating with federal agents, now combing through the decades-old records Kyra and Leah had uncovered. Every corrupt deal, every laundered dollar, every body buried to protect the Mathers and Whittakers was now part of a federal investigation. But Kyra didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow. The cost of the truth was measured not in headlines, but in silence. The silence where her mother's laughter used to be, the silence of every birthday, every graduation, every milestone Camille had missed because Eleanor Mathers had decided her life was inconvenient. "It's over," Leah said quietly, hanging up her phone. Kyra shook her head. "No, it's not." The final visit. The prison was cold, sterile, a world away from the towering courthouses and private clubs where Ellis Mathers once reigned. The man sitting across from Kyra was thinner now, the sharp edges of his face softened by guilt and sleepless nights. The orange jumpsuit looked alien on him, but fitting. It was a kind of justice, though not enough. "I saw the news," Ellis said softly, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "You did it." "No," Kyra said, her hands clasped in her lap. "I just survived." He shifted uncomfortably, his chains clinking softly. "I'm sorry." Kyra's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, she saw the man beneath the title. Small, broken, and too late. "You're sorry you got caught." He swallowed hard. "I should have protected you." Kyra's breath caught, but she shook her head. "You should have protected her." The silence between them stretched, filled with everything they'd lost. Finally, Kyra stood. "I didn't come here for your apology," she said. "I came to say goodbye." He blinked, confused. "Goodbye?" "You don't get to be my father," Kyra said softly, her voice trembling only slightly. "You gave up that right the day you let them kill her." He opened his mouth to respond, but Kyra was already walking away. She didn't look back. The legacy of names. The courthouse was quieter than usual, the halls empty by the fallout of the scandal. Photos of past judges, including Ellis Mathers, had been removed, the tarnished legacy too heavy to leave on display. Kyra walked those halls alone, her footsteps echoing off the marble. She paused at the courtroom where it had all begun, where she'd stood before Ellis, her voice shaking with the weight of a single word. "Daddy." That word no longer held power over her. She reached into her pocket, fingers closing around the silver bracelet her mother had been accused of stealing. The case that had brought her here. The case that had forced the truth into the light. It hadn't been about the bracelet. It never was. It was about breaking the silence. She left the bracelet on the judge's bench, not for Ellis, but for herself. A reminder that her voice had power, and that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth speaking. Epilogue. 1 year later. The sign over the office door was new, the paint still fresh. The Lattimore Foundation for Truth and Justice. Inside, Kyra sat behind a battered desk, her phone pressed to her ear as she took a call from another whistleblower, someone who'd seen too much and didn't know where to turn. "I believe you," Kyra said softly, her pen scratching across a legal pad. "And will help." Leah walked in, tossing a file onto her desk. Another case, another story that deserved to be heard. "Ready for round 2?" Leah asked. Kyra smiled. Small, but real. Always. Because silence had cost her everything. And now she would never be silent again.